Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who was burned at the stake for having the audacity to imagine that the universe might be just a little bit bigger than the Vatican thought it should be. His name was Giordano Bruno, and if you've never heard of him, well, that's partly because he lived in the shadow of Galileo, and partly because the Church really wanted everyone to forget he existed. But here's the thing about burning someone alive in the middle of Rome's most famous flower market. It tends to make an impression. And Bruno's ideas? They were so wild, so ahead of their time, that we're still catching up to some of them today. So settle in. We're going on a journey through 16th century Europe, where thinking the wrong thoughts could get you killed, where the universe was supposedly the size of a snow globe, and where one stubborn, brilliant, absolutely insufferable philosopher decided he'd rather die than admit he might be wrong. Spoiler alert, he was right about a lot of things, but boy did he pay for it. Chapter 1. The Boy from Nola. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548 in a small town called Nola, about 15 miles from Naples. Now, if you're picturing some idyllic Renaissance childhood filled with art and poetry and pleasant strolls through olive groves, well, adjust your mental image. This was southern Italy in the 16th century, which meant it was hot, crowded, periodically ravaged by plague, and ruled by Spanish overlords who weren't exactly known for their light touch. Bruno's birth name wasn't even Giordano. He was christened Filippo. But we'll get to the name change in a minute because it's tied up with the first major decision of his life, joining the Dominican order. Now, why would a bright kid from Nola become a Dominican friar? Well, for one thing, it was one of the few ways a poor boy could get an education. The Dominicans weren't just any religious order. They were the intellectual powerhouses of the Catholic Church. They were the order of preachers, founded back in the 13th century by Saint Dominic, and they took learning seriously. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. These were the guys who ran the Inquisition. For heaven's sake, if you wanted to study philosophy and theology at the highest level, the Dominicans were your ticket. So, in 1563, when he was 15 years old, Filippo entered the monastery of San Domenico Maggiore in Naples. And this is where he took the name Giordano, probably after Giordano Crispo, a prominent figure in the order. This was standard practice. You changed your name to mark your new life in Christ. But here's what makes Bruno fascinating, even as a teenager. He was a terrible monk, not in the sense that he was lazy or incompetent. No, Bruno was brilliant. He had one of those minds that just devoured information. He mastered Latin, learned Greek, studied Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and earned his doctorate in theology. By his mid-20s, he was an ordained priest. But he was also, shall we say, temperamentally unsuited to monastic life. He questioned everything. He argued with his superiors. He kept a copy of the works of Erasmus, which were on the index of forbidden books. He made sarcastic comments about the cult of the saints. And perhaps most dangerously, he started to doubt some of the fundamental doctrines of the Church. The breaking point came in 1576, when Bruno was 28. He was accused of heresy, specifically for allegedly removing images of saints from his cell and for reading forbidden books. Now, you might think this was a minor infraction. After all, he was just tidying up his room and doing some reading, right? Wrong. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church was in full Counter-Reformation mode. Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in Wittenberg back in 1517. And by Bruno's time, Europe was split between Catholics and Protestants. With both sides absolutely convinced that the other was going to hell, the Church was not in a forgiving mood. So Bruno did what any rational person would do. He ran. He fled the monastery, shed his Dominican robes, and became a fugitive. And thus began nearly 16 years of wandering across Europe, during which Bruno would become one of the most controversial intellectuals of his age. make enemies everywhere he went, and develop the cosmological theories that would eventually get him killed. But before we follow him on that journey, we need to understand something. What did the world look like to an educated person in 1576? Because to understand how radical Bruno's ideas were, we need to know what he was arguing against. Chapter 2. The universe according to everybody else. Imagine you're living in the late 16th century. You're educated. You've studied at a university. You know your Aristotle and your Ptolemy. What does the universe look like to you? Well, first of all, it's small. Cosmically small. The Earth sits at the center, unmoving, because obviously if the Earth were moving, we'd all fly off, right? The sun, moon, planets and stars all revolve around the Earth in perfect crystalline spheres. This is the Ptolemaic system, named after Claudius Ptolemy, the 2nd century Greco-Roman astronomer who codified this model. Now, this system wasn't stupid. It actually worked pretty well for predicting planetary positions, if you added enough epicycles, those little circles within circles that explained why planets sometimes appeared to move backward in the sky. Was it elegant? No. But it was precise, and it had the backing of both ancient authority and the Church. The universe in this model had exactly one world, ours. Everything else, the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, was made of a different substance called the quintessence, or fifth element. Earth had 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. But the heavens were perfect and unchanging, made of this incorruptible celestial matter. And beyond the sphere of the stars, nothing. The universe had an edge. It was finite. And beyond that edge was, well, the theological answer was complicated. But the point is there was nothing material there. No space, no time, nothing. This cosmology wasn't just science, it was theology. Aristotle had proved, to the satisfaction of medieval thinkers, that there could only be one world, because all heavy things naturally fell toward the center, and the center was Earth. If there were another world out there, its heavy things would be falling toward a different center, which was absurd. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century Dominican theologian, had reconciled Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. The result was a beautifully integrated worldview, in which physics, metaphysics, and theology all pointed in the same direction, toward a hierarchical cosmos, with Earth at the center, humans as God's special creation, and heaven literally above us in the celestial spheres. This wasn't just a scientific theory you could disagree with. This was the official position of the Catholic Church. To deny it was to deny the wisdom of Aristotle, the authority of Thomas Aquinas, and the teaching of the Church itself. Now, there was one problem with this model: Nicolaus Copernicus. Copernicus was a Polish astronomer and mathematician who, in 1543, published a book called On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres. In it, he proposed that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the universe. The Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. Now, Copernicus wasn't trying to overthrow Christian cosmology. He was trying to fix the mathematics. The Ptolemaic system, with all its epicycles, was getting unwieldy. Copernicus thought putting the sun at the center would simplify things, and it did, sort of. But here's the important thing. Copernicus still believed in a finite universe. He still had the stars fixed on a sphere at the edge of the cosmos. He still thought there was only one planetary system, and he was very careful to present his model as a mathematical hypothesis, not necessarily a physical reality. The Church, at first, didn't care much about Copernicus. His book was dedicated to the Pope. It was seen as a useful computational tool, even if it was physically absurd. The Earth move? Please. So when Bruno fled Naples in 1576, This was the intellectual landscape: a Ptolemaic orthodoxy, a controversial but not yet condemned Copernican alternative, and an absolute certainty that the universe was finite, singular, and centered on either the earth or the sun. Into this tidy picture, Giordano Bruno was about to throw a grenade. Chapter 3: The Wandering Years. After fleeing Naples, Bruno spent the next 16 years wandering Europe like some kind of Renaissance academic nomad. And let me tell you, he had a talent for wearing out his welcome. He went first to Rome, which seems like a strange choice for a fugitive from the Inquisition, but Bruno was never big on playing it safe. He didn't stay long. Then he headed north, to Genoa, to Turin, and then to Venice, where he worked as a tutor and earned a living by teaching the art of memory. Now, this is worth pausing on because Bruno was famous for his memory techniques. The Renaissance was obsessed with the art of memory, elaborate mental systems for storing and retrieving information. This was before printing had made books cheap and common, so being able to memorize vast amounts of text was a valuable skill. Bruno developed his own memory system, which involved constructing elaborate mental architecture, imaginary buildings filled with symbolic images that would trigger memories. It was based on ancient techniques but expanded with Bruno's own mystical and philosophical ideas. He could memorize entire books, deliver speeches without notes, and dazzle aristocratic patrons with his mental feats. This made him popular at courts and universities. It also made him money, which was good because he needed to eat. From Venice, Bruno moved to Padua, then to Brescia. Then in 1579 he crossed the Alps into Geneva. This turned out to be a mistake. Geneva was the heart of Calvinist Protestantism, and John Calvin's successor, Theodore Beza, was in charge. Bruno, with his typical lack of diplomatic sense, got into an argument with a Genevan professor, published a broadsheet attacking him, and promptly got arrested. He was excommunicated by the Calvinists, which must be some kind of record. It takes talent to get excommunicated by both the Catholics and the Protestants. Bruno left Geneva and headed to France, first to Lyon and then to Toulouse, where he managed to get a position teaching philosophy at the university. But after a year and a half, religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants made the city too dangerous, and Bruno moved on to Paris. Paris was a turning point. This was 1581, and King Henry III of France held court. Bruno arrived in Paris with a reputation as a brilliant, if difficult, intellectual. He dedicated his book on memory techniques to the king, and Henry was impressed enough to offer Bruno a position as a royal reader. This wasn't a permanent post, but it gave Bruno some financial stability and access to the French court. In Paris, Bruno published several works on the art of memory and began to develop his philosophical ideas more fully. He was reading everything he could get his hands on, not just Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, but also Plato, Plotinus, and the newly rediscovered Hermetic texts, supposedly ancient Egyptian writings that blended philosophy, magic, and mysticism. Bruno was developing a unique philosophical synthesis. He took Copernican astronomy, Hermetic mysticism, and his own wild imagination, and started constructing a vision of the universe that was unlike anything anyone had proposed before. But Paris, like everywhere else, eventually became uncomfortable. In 1583, religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants were escalating, and Bruno, sensing trouble, decided to leave. He went to England. Now, England in 1583 was a weird place for a Catholic, even a heretical one. Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne, and England was officially Protestant. Catholics were viewed with suspicion, and Jesuit missionaries were being hunted down and executed. But Bruno had a letter of recommendation from King Henry III to the French ambassador in London, and that gave him some protection. He settled in London and, through the ambassador's connections, found his way into the circle of Sir Philip Sidney and other English intellectuals. It was in England between 1583 and 1585 that Bruno wrote and published his most important works. These were written in Italian, not Latin, which was unusual for philosophical works, but made them more accessible. And in these books, Bruno laid out his revolutionary cosmological vision. He published the Ash Wednesday Supper, in which he defended the Copernican system and went far beyond it. He published On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, in which he argued, as the title suggests, that the universe was infinite and contained countless worlds like our own. He published The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, a satirical dialogue that mocked traditional religion and morality. These books made Bruno famous. They also made him enemies. His attacks on Aristotle and on Oxford professors, where he had briefly lectured, were harsh and personal. He called the Oxford dons pedants and grammarians. He mocked their reverence for ancient authority. The English, with their typical reserve, decided Bruno was brilliant but also kind of a jerk. By 1585, Bruno's position in England was becoming untenable. He had alienated too many people, and the political situation was getting dangerous. So he returned to Paris, but found that the political and religious climate there had deteriorated as well. He moved on to Germany, spending time in Marburg, Wittenberg, Prague, Helmstedt, and Frankfurt, teaching, publishing, and continuing to offend people with his sharp tongue and radical ideas. And then, in 1591, Bruno made the decision that would end his life. He accepted an invitation to return to Venice. Chapter 4. The Infinite Universe and Worlds. Before we get to Bruno's tragic return to Italy, we need to understand what he was actually saying in those books he published in England, because this is where Bruno goes from being an interesting Renaissance rebel to being a genuine revolutionary thinker. Let's start with the Copernican system. Copernicus said the Earth revolves around the Sun. Okay, fine, Bruno said. You know what? Copernicus didn't go far enough. In Bruno's cosmology, the Sun isn't the center of the universe because there is no center of the universe. The universe is infinite. It extends forever in all directions. And the Sun? It's just one star among countless others. Now, this seems obvious to us. We've grown up with images from the Hubble Space Telescope. We know there are hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy alone, and hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. But in 1584, this was a shocking, almost incomprehensible idea. Bruno argued that the stars we see in the night sky are suns, just like our sun, and around those suns, he speculated, there are planets, and on those planets there might be life, intelligent life, whole civilizations, each thinking they're at the center of creation, just like we do. Think about what this does to human significance. In the Aristotelian Christian cosmos, Earth is the center. Humans are God's special creation, and the entire drama of salvation, the fall, the incarnation, the redemption, happens here, on this unique world. But if there are infinite worlds, populated by infinite beings, what happens to that narrative? Are there infinite Christs, dying on infinite crosses for infinite humanities? The theological implications were staggering. Bruno went further. He argued that there's no fundamental difference between the earth and the heavens. The same laws apply everywhere. The moon isn't made of some incorruptible celestial substance. It's made of rock and dirt, just like Earth. The sun isn't a perfect sphere of quintessence. It's a ball of fire. This was heresy, but it was also incredibly modern. Bruno was arguing for what we'd now call the uniformity of nature, the idea that the same physical laws apply throughout the universe. This is a foundational assumption of modern science. Bruno also rejected the idea that the universe was created. He believed, following his reading of ancient philosophy, that the universe was eternal. It had no beginning and would have no end. God, in Bruno's view, was not a personal deity, who created the world at a specific moment and would judge it at the end of time. Instead, God was the infinite creative force that pervaded all of nature. God was in everything, and everything was in God. This is called pantheism, and the Church really didn't like it. Now, where did Bruno get these ideas? Not from observation. He didn't have a telescope. That wouldn't be invented for another 25 years. He wasn't doing experiments or making measurements. Bruno's cosmology was philosophical, based on reasoning and intuition. He was influenced by several sources. He'd read Copernicus, obviously. He'd also read the ancient atomists, philosophers like Epicurus and Lucretius, who believed that the universe was made up of infinite atoms moving through infinite void. Their works had been rediscovered during the Renaissance, and Bruno found in them a materialist cosmology that appealed to him. He was also deeply influenced by Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, mystical traditions that saw the universe as a living, divine organism. Bruno combined these ancient philosophies with Copernican astronomy and his own imaginative leaps to create something entirely new. Was he right about everything? No. He believed, for instance, that the planets were alive, that they had souls and moved through space by their own will, like animals. He thought the sun was at the center of our planetary system, but that it also moved through space, which is true, but not for the reasons he thought, but on the big questions, on the infinity of the universe, on the plurality of worlds, on the uniformity of nature. Bruno was pointing toward ideas that science would confirm over the next 4 centuries, and he was willing to die for them. Chapter 5. The Trap Closes. In 1591, after years of wandering, Bruno received an invitation that must have seemed like a godsend. Giovanni Mocenigo, a young Venetian nobleman, wanted Bruno to come to Venice and teach him the art of memory and other arcane knowledge. Venice was part of Italy, but it was a republic, fiercely independent, with its own inquisition that was notoriously more lenient than Rome's. Venice had a reputation for tolerating heterodox thinkers. Bruno probably figured he'd be safe there. He was wrong. Bruno arrived in Venice in the autumn of 1591 and moved into Mocenigo's house. He began teaching his patron, but things went sour quickly. Mocenigo wanted Bruno to teach him magical secrets, how to gain power and money through occult means. Bruno, whatever his faults, wasn't a con artist. He tried to teach Mocenigo genuine philosophy and memory techniques, but Mocenigo was disappointed. More than that, Mocenigo was shocked by Bruno's ideas. In their private conversations, Bruno spoke freely about his beliefs, that the universe was infinite, that there were countless worlds, that he doubted transubstantiation, the doctrine that the bread and wine of communion literally became the body and blood of Christ, that he questioned the divinity of Christ, that he thought much of Christian theology was nonsense. Mocenigo, whether from genuine religious conviction or from anger at not getting the magical shortcuts he wanted, decided to turn Bruno in. On May 22nd, 1592, Mocenigo wrote a letter to the Venetian Inquisition, denouncing Bruno as a heretic. On the night of May 23rd, officers came to Mocenigo's house and arrested Bruno. Bruno was imprisoned in Venice and interrogated. The Venetian Inquisition was interested in the specific heresies Mocenigo had reported. Bruno's denial of transubstantiation, his doubts about Christ's divinity, his blasphemous statements about Christianity. Bruno defended himself. He admitted he'd said some intemperate things, but he claimed his philosophical speculations were separate from matters of faith. He tried to present himself as a loyal, if wayward, son of the Church who'd made mistakes but could repent. At first, it seemed like he might succeed. The Venetian Inquisition was inclined to be lenient. But then Rome got involved. The Roman Inquisition demanded that Bruno be extradited. This was unusual. Venice normally didn't hand over prisoners to Rome, but political pressures were brought to bear. In January 1593, Venice reluctantly agreed to transfer Bruno to Rome, and that's when Bruno's fate was sealed. He was taken to Rome and imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palace of the Holy Office, the headquarters of the Roman Inquisition, and there he would remain for the next 7 years. 7 years. Let that sink in. Bruno was held in a Roman prison for 7 years, while the Inquisition built its case against him, interrogated him repeatedly, and tried to get him to recant. Why did it take so long? Partly because the Inquisition was thorough. They gathered his books, analyzed his writings, consulted with theologians. They wanted to make sure they had an airtight case. But also, they wanted Bruno to recant. The Inquisition's goal wasn't primarily to execute heretics. It was to save souls and maintain the unity of the Church. If Bruno would just admit he was wrong, renounce his errors, and submit to the Church's authority, they could reconcile him and impose a lesser penalty. But Bruno wouldn't do it. We don't have complete records of all the interrogations, but we know he was questioned repeatedly about his beliefs. He was asked about his cosmology, his theology, his doubts about Christian doctrine, and while Bruno sometimes tried to be diplomatic, to distinguish between philosophical speculation and dogmatic belief, he ultimately refused to recant his core ideas. He would not say the universe was finite. He would not say there was only one world. He would not say his philosophical vision was wrong. As the years dragged on, the Inquisition's patience ran out. In 1599, they presented Bruno with a list of heretical propositions extracted from his works, and demanded he abjure them. Bruno refused. On January 20th, 1600, Bruno was brought before the inquisitors for sentencing. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the most prominent theologian of the Counter-Reformation, was present. Bruno was declared a heretic, excommunicated, and turned over to the secular authorities for punishment. There's a famous story, probably apocryphal, that when Bruno heard his sentence, he said to his judges, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." Whether he actually said this or not, it captures something essential about Bruno: his defiance, his conviction, his refusal to bow. The penalty for relapsed heresy was death by burning. On February 17th, 1600, Bruno was taken to the Campo de' Fiori, the Field of Flowers, a market square in the center of Rome. A crowd gathered. Bruno was tied to a stake. His tongue was clamped or pierced, accounts vary, to prevent him from speaking heresy to the crowd at the last moment. And then they lit the fire. Giordano Bruno burned to death in the Campo de' Fiori at the age of 52. His ashes were thrown into the Tiber River. The Inquisition had one of his works publicly burned in St. Peter's Square. They wanted to erase him from history. They failed. Chapter 6. The Ideas That Wouldn't Die. After Bruno's execution, the Church tried to forget him. His books were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books. His name was rarely mentioned. When the Galileo affair erupted 33 years later, in 1633, Church officials were careful to distinguish Galileo's case from Bruno's. Galileo was being tried for heliocentrism, they said, not for the wild heresies that got Bruno killed. But Bruno's ideas didn't die with him. Throughout the 17th century, even as his name faded, his cosmological vision was being confirmed piece by piece by the new science. In 1610, Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the heavens and saw things that shocked the world. The moon had mountains and valleys. It wasn't a perfect celestial sphere. Jupiter had moons. Not everything revolved around the Earth. The Milky Way was made up of countless individual stars. Galileo didn't cite Bruno. That would have been dangerous. But he was seeing things Bruno had predicted. In 1687, Isaac Newton published the Principia Mathematica, laying out the laws of motion and universal gravitation. Newton showed that the same force that makes an apple fall to the ground also keeps the planets in their orbits. The heavens and the earth obeyed the same laws, just as Bruno had argued. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, astronomy expanded our understanding of the universe. William Herschel discovered Uranus and tried to measure the size of the Milky Way. Astronomers catalogued thousands of nebulae, fuzzy patches of light that might be distant star systems. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble used the Mount Wilson Observatory to prove that many nebulae were actually galaxies, vast collections of stars far beyond our own Milky Way. The universe was bigger than anyone had imagined, and it kept getting bigger. We now know the observable universe contains at least 2 trillion galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. The universe is so large that light from the most distant galaxies has been traveling for over 13 billion years to reach us. Bruno's infinite universe was starting to look prescient. What about his idea of other worlds? For centuries, this remained speculation. But in the 1990s, astronomers began detecting planets around other stars. The first confirmed exoplanet was discovered in 1995. As of today, we've confirmed more than 5,000 exoplanets, and we estimate there are billions of planets in our galaxy alone. Some of these planets are in the habitable zone, around their stars, where liquid water could exist. Some might harbor life. We don't know yet. But the idea that we might not be alone in the universe, that Bruno's countless inhabited worlds might actually exist, is no longer the stuff of heresy. It's a serious, scientific question. Does this mean Bruno was a scientist ahead of his time? Not exactly. Bruno didn't use the scientific method. He didn't make observations or conduct experiments. His cosmology was based on philosophical reasoning and mystical intuition, not empirical evidence. Many of his specific claims were wrong, but he had the right intuition. He grasped, through sheer imaginative force, that the universe was far larger and more complex than his contemporaries believed. He understood that there was no fundamental divide between the heavens and the earth. He saw that nature was uniform and that the same principles applied everywhere. In this sense, Bruno was a transitional figure. He lived at the end of the Renaissance, when philosophy and theology still dominated intellectual life. But he was pointing toward the scientific revolution that would come in the next century, and he paid the price for being ahead of his time. Chapter 7. Memory, Magic, and the Hermetic Tradition. We've talked a lot about Bruno's cosmology, but there's another side to his thought that's equally important and frankly weirder: his involvement with the art of memory and Hermetic magic. Remember, Bruno made his living for much of his life as a teacher of memory techniques. This wasn't just a parlor trick, it was connected to his entire philosophical system. The art of memory, as practiced in the Renaissance, was based on ancient techniques. You'd create an imaginary building in your mind, like a vast palace with many rooms. In each room, you'd place vivid, often bizarre images that represented the things you wanted to remember. To recall information, you'd take a mental walk through this palace, and the images would trigger your memory. This was useful for orators who needed to deliver long speeches without notes. For scholars who wanted to remember vast amounts of text, and for anyone who needed to store complex information before the age of cheap books and computers. But for Bruno, the art of memory was more than a mnemonic technique. It was a way of organizing knowledge, of understanding the structure of reality itself. In his memory systems, the images and symbols represented not just facts, but cosmic principles. To construct a memory palace was to construct a model of the universe. This connects to the Hermetic tradition, which had a huge influence on Bruno. The Hermetic texts were a collection of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly an ancient Egyptian sage. They were actually written in the early centuries of the Common Era, but Renaissance scholars didn't know that. They thought they'd rediscovered ancient wisdom predating Plato and Moses. These texts blended philosophy, astrology, alchemy, and magic. They presented a vision of the cosmos as a living, interconnected whole, where everything influenced everything else. The famous Hermetic maxim, "as above, so below," captured this idea. The macrocosm of the universe was reflected in the microcosm of the individual human being. Bruno was fascinated by this. He saw the Hermetic tradition as a way of understanding the divine nature that pervaded the universe. He practiced what was called natural magic, which wasn't about casting spells or summoning demons, but about understanding the hidden connections between things and using that knowledge. For instance, Bruno believed that by properly understanding the influences of the stars and planets, by constructing the right symbols and images, you could affect reality. This sounds crazy to us, but it made sense within a world view that saw the universe as fundamentally alive and interconnected. And here's where it gets interesting. Bruno's Hermeticism fed into his cosmology. The idea that the universe was infinite and filled with life wasn't just a scientific hypothesis for Bruno. It was a mystical vision. The infinite universe was the infinite expression of God's creative power. Every sun, every planet, every living thing was a manifestation of the divine. This is why the Church found Bruno so dangerous. He wasn't just proposing a new astronomical model, he was proposing a new religion, or what he saw as a return to an ancient, purer religion that had been corrupted by Christianity. In one of his works, The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, Bruno presented a satirical dialogue in which the gods of Olympus, representing moral and cosmic principles, decide to reform the heavens. It's a weird book, full of allegory and symbolism, but the basic message is clear. The moral and religious systems of his time were corrupt and needed to be replaced with something better. Needless to say, the Church didn't appreciate this. Now, modern readers sometimes struggle with this aspect of Bruno. We like the cosmology, it seems proto-scientific, but the magic and Hermeticism? That seems like embarrassing superstition. But you can't separate these elements in Bruno's thought. For him, they were all part of a unified vision. The infinite universe, the art of memory, the Hermetic wisdom, they all pointed toward the same truth, that the cosmos was alive, divine, and knowable to those who pursued wisdom with courage and insight. Was he right? Well, no, not about the magic. Planets don't have souls. Symbols don't have occult power. The universe isn't conscious. But Bruno's insistence that the universe was a unified, comprehensible whole, that everything was connected, that human beings could understand the cosmos through reason and observation, that was fundamentally correct. It's the basis of modern science. So maybe we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the weirder parts of Bruno's thought. They were the scaffolding that allowed him to construct his revolutionary cosmology. Chapter 8. Was it worth it? Let's talk about the question that hangs over Bruno's story. Was it worth it? Bruno refused to recant. He could have lived. He could have said, "You know what? You're right. I was wrong. The universe is finite. There's only one world. Jesus is divine. I'm sorry." He could have accepted a lesser punishment, maybe house arrest or banishment, and gone back to his books and his thoughts. But he didn't. He chose to die rather than deny what he believed was true. Was that brave, or was it stupid? From one perspective, it seems like a tragic waste. Bruno was 52 when he died. He might have lived another 20 or 30 years. He might have written more books, refined his ideas, influenced more people. What was the point of dying for beliefs that he couldn't prove, that most people thought were crazy? And it's not like his death changed anything immediately. The Church kept burning heretics. Copernican astronomy remained controversial for decades. Bruno's books stayed on the index of forbidden books for centuries. If he'd recanted and lived, would the history of science have been any different? Probably not. But there's another way to look at it. Bruno believed that truth mattered more than life. He believed that certain ideas, certain visions of reality, were worth defending regardless of the cost. and he believed that to recant, to say something he knew was false just to save his own skin, would be a betrayal not just of himself, but of truth itself. In his writings, Bruno often expressed contempt for cowardice, for people who knew the truth but lacked the courage to speak it. He saw himself as a heroic figure, a prophet willing to suffer for his vision. Was this arrogance? Maybe. Bruno had a high opinion of himself. He thought he was smarter than everyone else, and he wasn't shy about saying so. This didn't make him popular, but there's something admirable about his refusal to compromise. In an age when most people bent with the political and religious winds, when changing your stated beliefs to match whoever was in power was just pragmatic, Bruno stood firm, and his death mattered symbolically. It became a rallying point, eventually, for those who believed in freedom of thought. By the 19th century, Bruno was being celebrated as a martyr for science and philosophy, a man who died defending reason against religious tyranny. In 1889, freethinkers in Rome erected a statue of Bruno in the Campo de' Fiori, on the spot where he was burned. The statue shows Bruno standing, hooded, looking stern and defiant. The inscription reads, "To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw, on this place where the pyre burned." The Vatican objected to the statue, of course, but it stands there still, in the middle of a flower market, a reminder that some ideas are dangerous enough to kill people for, and that some people would rather die than pretend they don't believe them. So was it worth it? That depends on what you think human life is for. If survival is the only goal, then no, Bruno's choice makes no sense. But if you believe that living with integrity, speaking truth as you understand it, and refusing to bow to unjust authority, if you believe those things have value, then maybe Bruno's choice makes perfect sense. He lost his life, but he kept his soul. And 400 years later, we're still talking about him. Chapter 9. Bruno and Galileo. A tale of two heretics. You can't talk about Bruno without talking about Galileo Galilei, because their stories are intertwined in complicated ways, and because comparing them tells us something important about how ideas survive or perish. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564, 16 years after Bruno. He became a mathematician, physicist, and astronomer, and in 1610, when he turned his telescope to the heavens and saw the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, he became a convinced Copernican. Galileo wrote about his discoveries, promoted heliocentrism, and eventually got in trouble with the Church. In 1633, he was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his support for Copernicanism, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1642, blind and confined, but alive. The conventional story is that both Bruno and Galileo were martyrs for science, persecuted by a church that feared new ideas. But the reality is more complicated. First, Bruno wasn't tried for his cosmology alone. He was tried for a whole package of heresies, denying the divinity of Christ, rejecting transubstantiation, questioning the Trinity, claiming the universe was eternal and infinite, and practicing magic. His cosmology was part of a larger theological challenge to Christianity itself. Galileo, on the other hand, was much more cautious. He presented Copernicanism as a mathematical hypothesis. He insisted he was a good Catholic. He tried to argue that the Bible, properly interpreted, wasn't incompatible with a moving earth. He wanted to reform the Church's position, not overthrow it. Second, Galileo had scientific evidence. His telescopic observations of Jupiter's moons proved that not everything revolved around the Earth. His observations of Venus's phases proved that Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth. He had data. Bruno had philosophy and intuition. He couldn't prove the universe was infinite, or that there were other worlds. He just believed it. Third, Galileo recanted. When the Inquisition threatened him with torture and execution, he knelt and declared, "I abjure, curse and detest the said errors and heresies. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, but he lived. And he kept working. He wrote his most important work on physics, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences, while under house arrest. Bruno refused to recant and burned. So who was right? Who had the better strategy? From a purely practical standpoint, Galileo was smarter. He survived. He published. His ideas eventually won. Science progressed. But there's something unsettling about Galileo's recantation. He said he didn't believe what he clearly did believe. He compromised his integrity to survive. And while we can't really blame him, he was 70 years old and facing torture. There's something diminished about it. Bruno, by contrast, never wavered. He stood by his beliefs to the end. He's a hero, if a tragic one. But here's the irony. Galileo's work mattered more to the development of science than Bruno's did. Galileo's observations and experiments laid the groundwork for modern physics. Newton built on Galileo's work. Bruno's philosophical speculations, brilliant as they were, didn't lead anywhere scientifically. They couldn't. He had no way to test them. So what's the lesson? That martyrdom is overrated? That it's better to live and work quietly than to die for a dramatic gesture? Maybe. But I think the real lesson is that history needs both kinds of people. It needs the Galileos, who do the careful work, who gather evidence, who compromise when they have to in order to keep advancing knowledge. And it needs the Brunos, who stake out radical positions, who refuse to back down, who demonstrate that some principles are worth dying for. Galileo's science lived on, but Bruno's example lived on too. He became a symbol of intellectual freedom, of the right to think dangerous thoughts and speak them aloud. In the long run, both were necessary. Science advanced through careful observation and experimentation. But the freedom to do science, to question orthodoxy without fear of execution, that required people like Bruno, who were willing to pay the ultimate price for the right to think. Chapter 10. The Rehabilitation That Never Came. In the centuries after Bruno's death, the Church's attitude toward him remained hostile. While other cases were quietly reconsidered, Bruno stayed condemned. Galileo was formally pardoned by Pope John Paul II in 1992, 359 years after his trial. The Pope acknowledged that the Church had erred in condemning Galileo, that theological authorities had wrongly believed the Bible dictated a specific cosmology. But Bruno? No such luck. Why the different treatment? Because while Galileo was ultimately tried for a scientific position that turned out to be correct, Bruno was tried for a complex set of theological heresies that the Church still considers heretical. You can say, "Oops, we were wrong about the earth moving," without threatening core doctrine. You can't say, "Oops, we were wrong about the Trinity, the Incarnation, and transubstantiation," without unraveling Catholicism itself. And Bruno's pantheism, his belief that God was in everything and everything was in God, that the universe was eternal and infinite, that there was no meaningful distinction between creator and creation, all of this remains incompatible with Christian theology. So Bruno stays condemned. In the year 2000, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the Vatican Secretary of State, was asked about the possibility of rehabilitating Bruno. He said that Bruno's execution was sad, but that it was necessary to distinguish between Bruno and Galileo. Bruno's errors were more than scientific, and the Church could not revise its position on theological matters. Which is to say, we're sorry we burned him, sort of, but he was definitely a heretic, and we can't say we were wrong. This frustrates many people, especially secularists, and those who see Bruno as a hero of free thought. They argue that the Church should admit it was wrong to execute anyone for their beliefs, regardless of whether those beliefs were correct or not. But the Church's position, while it may seem cold, is internally consistent. From the Church's perspective, theological truth matters. Heresy isn't just a difference of opinion. It's a corruption that can lead souls to damnation. If you believe that, then suppressing heresy, even violently, can seem justified, however unpalatable we find it today. Of course, most people today, including most Catholics, don't think burning heretics is ever justified. We've moved on from that. The Church itself no longer executes heretics, obviously, but officially acknowledging that Bruno's execution was wrong would require admitting that the Inquisition, an institution that operated for centuries with papal approval, was fundamentally unjust. And institutions don't like admitting that. So Bruno remains in a strange limbo. He's celebrated by secular humanists and freethinkers as a martyr for intellectual freedom. He's taught in philosophy classes as a transitional figure between medieval and modern thought. His statue stands in Rome, a symbol of defiance against authority. But the Catholic Church still considers him a heretic. And in some ways, that's fitting. Bruno would probably have been contemptuous of any attempt to rehabilitate him. He didn't want the Church's approval. He wanted the Church to admit it was wrong about everything, and that was never going to happen. Chapter 11. Bruno's legacy in philosophy and science. So what's Bruno's actual legacy? What did he contribute, and what do we remember him for? First, and most importantly, Bruno helped break the spell of Aristotelian cosmology, the idea that the universe was finite, that the heavens were fundamentally different from the earth, that there was only one world. These were deeply ingrained assumptions in Western thought. They weren't just scientific theories. They were part of the worldview that structured how people thought about everything. Bruno attacked these assumptions head-on. He declared them absurd. And while he didn't have the evidence to prove they were wrong, his willingness to imagine alternatives helped create space for the scientific revolution that followed. Copernicus had suggested that maybe the Earth moved around the sun. Bruno said, "That's a start, but the universe is infinite. There are countless suns and planets, and we're not special." This was a radical break, and it paved the way for the cosmological insights that would come later. Second, Bruno's pantheism influenced later philosophers. Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher, developed a philosophical system in which God and nature were identical. Deus sive natura, God or nature, Spinoza said, using a formula that Bruno would have recognized. Spinoza was excommunicated by his Jewish community for heresy, in part because his ideas were too close to Bruno's. In the 19th century, Romantic poets and philosophers embraced Bruno as a visionary. They loved his idea of an infinite, living universe. They saw him as a rebel against narrow rationalism and dogmatic religion. Third, Bruno became a symbol. By the 19th and 20th centuries, he was being celebrated not for his specific philosophical doctrines, most of which were outdated or wrong, but for his courage. He became the poster child for freedom of thought, for the right to pursue truth wherever it leads, even if it offends the powerful. The statue in Campo de' Fiori, erected in 1889, was as much a political statement as a memorial. It was free thinkers, many of them anti-clerical, who raised the money for it. They were sending a message to the Vatican. We remember what you did, and we won't forget. In the 20th century, scientists and science communicators embraced Bruno as a precursor. Carl Sagan, in his television series Cosmos, devoted part of an episode to Bruno, portraying him as a visionary who saw the infinite universe before anyone else. This portrayal was historically debatable. Sagan downplayed Bruno's mysticism and exaggerated his scientific credentials. But it was effective. For a generation of viewers, Bruno became a hero of science. But there is a tension in how we remember Bruno. Do we celebrate him as a proto-scientist who anticipated discoveries that would come centuries later? Or do we celebrate him as a martyr for freedom of thought, regardless of whether he was right? I'd argue we should do both, but with nuance. Bruno wasn't a scientist in the modern sense. He didn't use the scientific method. His cosmology was philosophical and mystical, not empirical. Many of his ideas were wrong, but he was right about the big picture. The universe is vast, far vaster than anyone in his time imagined. There are countless worlds. The laws of nature apply everywhere, and human beings, through reason and observation, can understand the cosmos. And he demonstrated, through his life and death, that intellectual freedom is worth fighting for, that the right to think and speak and argue matters more than comfort or safety or even life itself. That's a legacy worth remembering. Chapter 12. The Man Behind the Martyr. We've talked a lot about Bruno's ideas and his death, but what was he actually like as a person? Because if we're going to remember him, we should remember him as a human being, not just as a symbol. And the honest answer is, he was kind of a difficult guy. Bruno had a temper. He was arrogant. He thought he was smarter than everyone else, and he wasn't shy about saying so. He insulted his colleagues, mocked his opponents, and had a talent for making enemies. In his book The Ash Wednesday Supper, he described attending a dinner in England where he debated with Oxford scholars. He portrayed himself as a brilliant philosopher, patiently explaining obvious truths to pedantic fools. He mocked the English food, the English manners, and especially the English academics, whom he called grammarians, obsessed with trivial points of Aristotelian commentary. This did not win him friends at Oxford. Throughout his life, Bruno moved from place to place, partly because he was a fugitive, but partly because he kept offending people. He'd arrive in a city, impress people with his brilliance, get into arguments, say something that alienated his patrons or colleagues, and have to move on. He was also convinced of his own genius in a way that could be grating. He saw himself as a prophet, bringing ancient wisdom and new insights to a benighted age. He compared himself to great philosophers of the past. He thought his works would revolutionize human thought. And you know what? He was partly right. His cosmological vision was revolutionary. But his certainty about his own importance, his contempt for those who disagreed with him, these weren't attractive qualities. At the same time, we should give Bruno some credit. He lived in an age when intellectual life was constrained by religious and political authority. Speaking freely could get you killed, as it eventually did for him. In that context, his willingness to speak his mind, to challenge orthodoxy, to insist on his own vision even when everyone told him he was wrong, that took courage. And beneath the arrogance, there was a passionate belief in the importance of seeking truth. Bruno wasn't a cynic. He genuinely believed that philosophy mattered, that understanding the nature of the universe was the highest calling of human beings. He also had a sense of humor, albeit a sharp one. His satirical works, like The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, are full of wit and wordplay. He enjoyed intellectual combat. He liked argument for its own sake. Was he likable? Probably not, at least not consistently. But he was interesting. He was passionate, and he was absolutely committed to his vision. And in the end, when the Inquisition demanded he recant, when they offered him the choice between life and integrity, he chose integrity. Whatever his flaws, that's admirable. We don't have to like Bruno to respect him. We don't have to approve of his personality to honor his courage. He was a difficult, brilliant, stubborn man who saw farther than his contemporaries and paid the ultimate price for it. That's enough. Chapter 13. Bruno in popular culture. In recent decades, Bruno has made appearances in popular culture, usually as a symbol of science versus religion, or free thought versus dogma. We already mentioned Carl Sagan's Cosmos, which introduced Bruno to millions of viewers in the 1980s. Sagan portrayed Bruno as a visionary who imagined the infinite universe and was burned for his trouble. The image of Bruno was romanticized, presenting him primarily as a martyr for science, while downplaying his mysticism and hermeticism. In 2009, the Vatican astronomer, Reverend José Gabriel Funes, gave an interview in which he discussed the possibility of extraterrestrial life. He said that belief in aliens was compatible with Catholic theology. Some commentators noted the irony. Here was the Vatican acknowledging that Bruno's speculation about other worlds wasn't heretical after all. Of course, the Vatican didn't go so far as to rehabilitate Bruno, but the shift in perspective was notable. Bruno has appeared in novels and plays. In one science fiction novel, he's imagined as having been rescued from his execution by time travelers. In various dramas, he's portrayed as a tragic hero, a man ahead of his time, destroyed by a fearful and repressive church. There's even a crater on the moon named after him, Bruno Crater, on the far side of the moon, honoring the man who insisted the moon was a world like Earth. But perhaps the most interesting recent appearance of Bruno was in the 2014 reboot of Cosmos, hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like Sagan before him, Tyson devoted time to Bruno's story, presenting him as an example of how dangerous ideas can be and how important it is to protect intellectual freedom. Some critics complain that both versions of Cosmos got the history wrong, that they exaggerated Bruno's role in the scientific revolution and minimized the complexity of his trial. And there's some truth to that. Bruno wasn't primarily a scientist. His trial wasn't primarily about Copernicanism. The story is more complicated than brave scientist versus evil church. But I think the Cosmos episodes captured something important. Bruno's story matters not because he was a perfect hero, but because he represents the struggle for intellectual freedom. He represents the right to think dangerous thoughts, to question authority, to imagine possibilities that challenge the status quo. And that's why his story keeps being retold. Every generation needs heroes who stood up for ideas, who refused to back down, who paid the price for speaking truth as they saw it. Bruno is one of those heroes. Flawed, complicated, but ultimately inspiring. Chapter 14. What would Bruno think of our universe? Let's indulge in a bit of speculation. If Giordano Bruno could somehow be brought forward in time and shown what we know about the universe today, what would he think? First, he'd be thrilled to learn that the universe is even bigger than he imagined. He thought it was infinite, which we can't prove, but we know the observable universe contains at least 2 trillion galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. That's 10 to the power of 24 stars, a number so large it's almost meaningless. Bruno would love that. He'd probably say, "See, I told you, infinite worlds." He'd be fascinated by exoplanets. We've confirmed thousands of planets around other stars, and we're finding new ones all the time. Some are gas giants like Jupiter. Some are rocky worlds like Earth. Some are in the habitable zone where liquid water could exist. We haven't found life yet, but Bruno would be confident we will. He believed the universe was teeming with life. Every sun had planets. Every planet had inhabitants. He might be disappointed that we haven't made contact with alien civilizations yet, but he'd probably say we're just not looking hard enough. He'd be amazed by our understanding of physics. The fact that the same laws of gravity and motion apply throughout the universe, that light travels at a constant speed, that matter and energy are interconvertible. All of this would confirm his intuition that the universe is fundamentally unified and comprehensible. But I think there are things that would puzzle or disappoint him too. For one thing, the universe isn't eternal. It had a beginning. The Big Bang happened about 13.8 billion years ago. Before that, there was no space, no time, no matter, nothing. Bruno believed the universe was eternal. He thought creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, was absurd. So the Big Bang theory would challenge one of his core beliefs. Of course, being Bruno, he'd probably come up with some way to argue that the Big Bang doesn't really count as a beginning, that maybe there was something before the Big Bang, some kind of quantum vacuum or multiverse. He'd find a way to preserve his belief in eternality. He'd also be puzzled by quantum mechanics, the idea that particles can be in superposition, that observation affects reality, that there's fundamental randomness at the quantum level. All of this is deeply weird and would challenge Bruno's deterministic view of the universe. But again, Bruno was comfortable with paradox and mystery. He believed the universe was ultimately incomprehensible to human reason in its full depth. So maybe he'd embrace quantum weirdness as proof that reality is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. What about his mysticism and magic? Well, those haven't held up. The planets don't have souls. Symbols don't have occult power. The universe isn't conscious, at least not in any meaningful sense. But Bruno might argue that science, in revealing the profound interconnectedness of all things, the way quantum entanglement links particles across vast distances, the way the universe evolved from a single point to its current complexity, has vindicated his intuition that everything is connected, that the cosmos is a unified whole. He'd be wrong, of course. Science doesn't support Hermetic magic. But Bruno was good at reinterpreting things to fit his worldview. Overall, I think he'd be delighted. He spent his life arguing for a vast, infinite, populated universe, and while the details are different from what he imagined, the big picture has been confirmed. And I think he'd be proud that we remember him, that his name is associated with cosmological vision and intellectual courage, that his statue stands in Rome as a monument to free thought. He'd probably write a very long, very arrogant book about how he was right all along and everyone else should have listened to him. And you know what? We'd probably read it. Chapter 15. The question of heresy. Let's talk about heresy, because that's what Bruno was convicted of, and it's a concept that deserves some unpacking. The word heresy comes from the Greek haresis, meaning choice. A heretic is someone who chooses to believe something different from orthodox doctrine. In the context of medieval and early modern Christianity, heresy was a serious crime, punishable by excommunication, imprisonment, or death. Why did the Church care so much about heresy? Why not just let people believe what they wanted? From the Church's perspective, heresy was dangerous for several reasons. First, it threatened the unity of Christendom. Christianity claimed to be the one true faith, revealed by God. If different people believed different things, how could Christianity maintain its claim to exclusive truth? Second, heresy endangered souls. The Church taught that salvation came through correct belief and practice. If you believed the wrong things, you might be damned. By tolerating heresy, the Church would be allowing people to damn themselves and others. Third, heresy threatened social order. In a world where religious and political authority were intertwined, where kings ruled by divine right and the Church sanctioned their power, religious dissent could lead to political rebellion. Heresies like those of the Cathars or the Hussites had led to wars and uprisings. So the Church established the Inquisition to root out heresy. Inquisitors would investigate suspected heretics, interrogate them, and try to get them to recant. If they succeeded, the heretic would be reconciled to the Church, usually with some penalty. If they failed, the heretic would be handed over to secular authorities for execution. This seems barbaric to us now, and it was, but it made sense within the worldview of the time. If you genuinely believe that heresy leads to eternal damnation, that it spreads like a disease and corrupts the faithful, then aggressive measures to suppress it can seem justified, even merciful. Bruno was convicted of multiple heresies. He denied the divinity of Christ, claiming Jesus was a magician, not God incarnate. He rejected transubstantiation, the doctrine that the bread and wine of communion literally become Christ's body and blood. He questioned the Trinity. He claimed the universe was eternal, contradicting the doctrine of creation. Any one of these would have been enough to convict him. Together, they made him one of the most dangerous heretics the Inquisition had ever encountered. But here's the interesting question. Was Bruno actually wrong? Theologically, from the Church's perspective? Yes, absolutely. The divinity of Christ, the Trinity, transubstantiation, these are core doctrines of Christianity. To deny them is to cease being Christian in any meaningful sense. But philosophically, scientifically, Bruno's cosmological views have been largely vindicated. The universe is vast, perhaps infinite. There are countless worlds. The same natural laws apply everywhere. His theological views are matters of faith, not subject to empirical verification. You either believe in the Trinity or you don't. But his cosmology was a matter of reason and observation, and he was right. So we're left with a strange situation. Bruno was executed for heresy. Some of his heresies were theological speculations that can't be proven true or false. But some of his heresies were insights into the nature of reality that turned out to be correct. This raises uncomfortable questions. How many other heretics throughout history were killed for beliefs that were actually true? How much knowledge was suppressed because it contradicted religious dogma? How many potential Brunos never spoke up because they saw what happened to those who did? We can't know. But Bruno's story reminds us that orthodoxy, whether religious or ideological, can be a barrier to truth. Sometimes the heretics are wrong, but sometimes they're right. And killing them doesn't make them any less right. It just makes us complicit in silencing truth. Conclusion. The heretic's gift. We've come to the end of our lesson on Giordano Bruno, this difficult, brilliant, stubborn man who looked at the night sky and saw infinity. So, what do we take away from his story? First, that ideas have consequences. Bruno wasn't killed for being annoying, though he was annoying. He wasn't killed for being a bad Catholic, though he was a terrible Catholic. He was killed because his ideas challenged the fundamental worldview of his time. He imagined a universe without center or edge, without hierarchy, without a special place for humanity, and that was intolerable to those in power. Second, that intellectual courage is rare and valuable. It's easy to go along, to accept what you're told, to keep your dangerous thoughts to yourself. Bruno could have done that. He could have recanted and lived. But he chose integrity over survival, and that choice, however costly, matters. It reminds us that truth, or at least the honest pursuit of truth, is worth something. Third, that being right isn't enough. Bruno was right about the infinite universe, about other worlds, about the uniformity of nature. But he couldn't prove it. He had intuition and philosophy, but no empirical evidence. That's why his ideas didn't immediately change anything. Galileo, with his telescope and his observations, did more to advance astronomy than Bruno did with all his brilliant speculation. But Galileo built on the ground Bruno had prepared. Bruno made it possible to imagine alternatives to Aristotelian cosmology. He showed that the old certainties could be questioned, and that made the scientific revolution possible. Fourth, that we need heretics. Not because heretics are always right, they're often wrong, but because dissent is how we test our beliefs. If everyone agrees, if no one questions, if orthodoxy is enforced by threats of punishment, then we can't know whether what we believe is true or simply what we've been told to believe. Bruno was a heretic. He challenged the Church, challenged Aristotle, challenged common sense. He was often wrong. But on the big questions, the questions that mattered most, he was right. And finally, that some things are worth dying for. This is the hardest lesson, because most of us, myself included, would probably recant if faced with burning at the stake. We'd rationalize it. I can always think what I want privately. Saying the words doesn't change what I know to be true. Living to fight another day is smarter than dying for a gesture. And maybe that's right. Maybe Bruno should have recanted. Maybe martyrdom is overrated. But I don't think so. I think Bruno's refusal to compromise, his insistence that he would rather die than lie about what he believed, gave his life a meaning and weight that survival wouldn't have. He became a symbol, an inspiration, a reminder that some principles matter more than comfort or safety. We remember Bruno not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to pay the ultimate price for his vision of truth. That's rare. That's precious. And that's why, 424 years after his execution, we're still talking about him. Why his statue stands in the Campo de' Fiori. Why his name is spoken with admiration and respect. Giordano Bruno looked at the stars and saw infinity. He looked at the universe and saw divine creativity without limit. He looked at humanity and saw not the center of creation, but one small part of an inconceivably vast cosmos. And when they told him to say he was wrong, he refused. For that, they burned him. For that, we remember him. Good night. And in case you've enjoyed our evening talk so much, and still might be awake, here is another educational video for you.